Third time's the charm, March 2025, age 31. This literary masterwork of the ages, Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky, came out in 1866. And in the more than a century and a half since its publication, there has been an innumerable body of work analyzing what it's got to offer that is easily discoverable on the internet. So I'm not lending my voice to that. You can find that on your own. I'm just going to be talking about one of my favorite books. So, and very, very much summarizing. Believe me when I say I could endlessly babble for like 10 plus hours on all of the modern implications to modern social paradigms and themes of, how to look at morality, crime, the idea of universal moral principles and whatnot. But I won't, instead of just major bullet points, because my channel is about trying to hype people up to think for themselves and actually, read and reap the benefits. Both personal self-education benefits, stretching your intellect, and entertainment. So, but this is not easy to talk about because it's so good. It's so real. It feels like a true story based on reality. And so, for example, moral gray areas. The plot, a young, starving student with a big ego, huge potential future, philosophical ideas, altruistic, passionate to a fault, trying to come to terms with his position in society and justice and virtue and all of these altruistic matters matter to him, but he's rapidly discovering the reality of the real world, how unfair and unjust and corrupt everything innately is, how much what the justice system lacks, and the immorality of the times. So it is, since its publication, exponentially more relevant now, more than I'll ever be able to describe. But it comes to a point where his ambitions get him making bad decisions financially, being young, inexperienced, immature, but so committed to his own philosophy, he ends up feeling justified in redefining what society has dictated is right and wrong as it concerns making his way through the universe. To make a long story short, that has to do, and I feel like this is okay to spoil, but if you still care about spoilers, spoiler alert, I mean, it's been 150 plus years since this came out. I think it's okay to spoil. So, long story short, he wants to kill the landlady because the landlady's crooked and he's just unable to make his payments, and essentially she's the representation of everything that's evil and unfair in society according to him. Like, who couldn't relate to that when you're just trying to survive, especially considering the fact that most people across all times have always been poor, and they know how hard it is and how corrupt every freaking institution imaginable is, whether it's people that own properties that you're renting, or jobs, or corporations, or governments, or whatever. And so this is a theme of, like, I would say it's not so much pointing out what's wrong with society that leads Raskolnikov to eventually just kind of go nuts and start acting like judge, jury, and executioner on people. It's, by contrast, his situation versus the people around him who are a little bit more established, like the landlady, like the police officers, and so on. You see what society lacks. What society, and that is something unusually good that establishes the realism and endless, immersion factor of this book. It's the fact that this is a very good, has a coming of age element that's just infinitely relatable and timeless. It's the fact that coming to realize that if you want to be a citizen and do anything good in this world, you're going to have to attach yourself to how society views good and bad, either acting upon what you feel whether you want to get involved legally, or Breaking Bad, turning criminal and trying to get away with murder or the equivalent, as so many people have always throughout history done one way or the other. But if you really care about success and you want to be someone, you're eventually going to have to make that call, because the horrible reality of growing up is the fact that the world is a bloody, chaotic free-for-all underneath all of our thin, commercialized disguises. That's my personal opinion. That's how I interpret this. That makes the book infinitely relatable to anyone. So basically, he commits murder, but then her sister walks in, unexpectedly seeing him commit the murder. Then he panics and has a sort of moment of realization of what he's done. It is madness. It's just too much pressure. He can't understand how he's technically in violation of the grander principle that human life matters and you shouldn't kill, you should avoid it at all costs. But he was taking initiative, and so he couldn't deal with the preconceived notions of what's right or wrong, what he should do as a man to try to get even with society, fit into society, secure his financial situation by taking her out. And so in his madness, he kills her too. And so the second murder is accidental. Now here's my personal interpretation by the end of the story after much reflection, and I promise you, it's unlikely that you'll be able to agree with yourself as you evolve as a person in the time between finishing this book and whatever your future present is. That was the case with me. So in retrospect, in hindsight, I could see an argument, well, I'm not going to say one way or the other, because everybody interprets it differently, and I don't know. But if I was forced to choose, I'll be honest, I could see that the first murder was justified, meaning it had harmony with the spirit of what's actually right, or the spirit of the law. Now, my theory is that modern Western audiences would say no, and maybe that's why Dostoevsky included the scenario of the second murder, as fate had it, in the book, in the plot, because you see, if you're going to delegate, every individual unfair situation to the affected, those that are affected by the consequences of society lacking universally held moral principles of moral laws and rules to individuals, if you're going to delegate the ruling and allow people, because of whatever unfair, Luciferian philosophy is what they call it, how I've heard it described. If you're going to delegate that to individuals, basically you're also discrediting how that will affect other people when you take democracy out of the picture. And I think that's why he included the scenario of the second murder. It's painting a morally responsible, symbolic narrative development where, sure, what acting on emotion and can confuse logic and also can tragically destroy a young person, especially a young person's future. Anyone who's caught up in overly philosophizing and rationalizing their will to succeed in the universe and telling themselves that they're feeling justified. And you feel that so powerfully, so emotionally in the story. You're empathizing with someone that is on a very dark path, who's going off the rails with madness, and at the same time is essentially becoming a villain, but he can't see it, and neither can we. So it is the opposite of a black and white romantic tale. It is a hardcore, difficult to process, difficult to understand, brutally honest look at the moral grays, the insufficiencies of society, the reality of the actual, all the unfair conditions that lead a very good, well-meaning person who's too good for this world down a path of self-deception and doing things they never thought possible beforehand, which all of us are technically capable of. And that's a horrifying reality for a lot of the average mashed potato brain, no patience, non-thinking westernized person to digest, making it therefore all the more utterly, relevant to today with all today's horrific, the rise of political radicalism and emotional bias influencing law and order and even policy making and court rulings and juries and all that sort of stuff that we're seeing. We're seeing people try to justify as revenge and redress of old grievances, resurrect this hate of colonization, so it's not to go on political tangents with today's present modern American politics. It's hard not to, trust me, but it is in summary, it's infinitely relatable, probably more so now than it was in 1866. So it's crazy to think about just how infinitely relatable such an internal struggle is that is often traditionally not seen in a popular, like, transparent, like, narrative like this. It leads me to believe that there was never a book published with this level of quality altogether, generally speaking, before or after. And if there was, I probably would have heard of it by now. It just so happens I haven't found a book that has had like quite such a moving effect on me in these ways that I'm trying to describe. So another way of saying this is that, to put it very bluntly, you could argue that in the grander cosmic scheme of things, I call it rule of law or spirit of law, the first murder that Raskolnikov commits could be justified. Now, most modern Western people, though, I'm making the argument, would probably say, no, I would rather, go with the popular vote or the peer pressure, or delegate my thinking individual ability to take my heart out of the picture and trust in a pile of contrived, lifeless rules and regulations. In other words, this very vain and futile investment of faith in law and order as it's concerned with the letter of the law. Stuff like Old Testament stuff that I like to believe that we're smarter than, like eye for an eye. I mean, was not the original Ten Commandments the result, in one sense, not so much an enlightenment for the original Israelites, but a sort of curse because they weren't ready for the higher law? So that's just one interpretation of that. In other words, it's a regression of evolution on the spiritual level. It's eye for an eye instead of Jesus' New Testament evolved way of forgiveness, which has had such a large, long-standing background influence on our, in America, law and order, the justice system, with the Judeo-Christian element, that sort of thing. Similarly, the principle that all life matters no matter what. Now, having to do with that a lot, we are given sympathy for the character, who is arguably a villain, arguably an anti-hero, or goes from anti-hero to villain depending on how you individually interpret that. And I forgot to mention, everybody interprets the story differently. You can't read this and not come away moved or emotionally invested, at least, and probably enlightened somewhat, or at least thinking about morality and killing and heavy scary topics differently, since in a good way, in a way that is better experienced younger, to distance yourself from getting too heavily involved in cases where the long-term consequences can only really be felt if you actively, take a role in witnessing or experiencing them, heaven forbid, committing them. In other words, it's better to learn from lessons of history than to repeat it, because the reality of human history is that it's utterly fucked up, chaotic, dark, depressing, and the reality of human beings is that we're very self-righteous, narcissistic, emotionally charged, judgmental, chaotic creatures that can deceive ourselves into doing horrible things to each other if the right amount of conditions happen and pressure happens, even if we're so convinced of our morality and have really persuasive arguments. That's a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow, that like to think in terms of black and white, and like to think things like, well, there's good people, there's bad people, an eye for an eye mentality, murderers and stuff. By the end of the story, though, we learn that this huge metamorphosis of the character, talk about character building, character development. Could there be a better example in all of literature? I don't know. I don't think so, because the lesson that comes away from the punishment has a positive, hopeful outcome, and that's just how I interpret it individually. That is that Raskolnikov sort of learns, I think, a sort of new value to human life, because he's never able to fully, technically recover or reconcile what he did. But in order to gain his sanity, he starts to play a more active role in people's lives, open up to people more. And there's a side of him that his emotional imbalance happens, not able to accept the reality of the consequences of what he did, that makes him want to confess, and confess to certain people at different times. You get some of the best dialogue in all of history as a result of this. It comes as, very emotional, very enlightening, very inspiring, and just altogether fulfilling in a hopeful way. Like I do not have the poetic verbal ability to do justice to just the sheer amount of depth and quality that this book will, especially if you have imagination and if you read this with faith and patience and respect for, keep with an open mind for the potential depth of knowledge it does contain. Generally speaking, you're going to come away a better person, I think, because the greatest books of all is fiction that tells the truth with a hopeful undertone. In other words, I think that Dostoevsky and also it's part of the reason why the book is so immersive and compelling and realistic with all those little details, because, and that shows in the dialogue too, even though the monologues can be tedious at times, and that's a big turnoff to a lot of low patience, isolated monkey brain Western audiences. What I'm saying is, like, there's so much hope in the background of the intent of the story. One is led to think that the creative stylistic process of making it all come to life, because, for example, they all sound like real people with real different takes on all these deep philosophical moral dialogue that comes about in such practical instances in day-to-day life that's utterly relatable. So people of poor backgrounds and no access to education can easily, this is very accessible. That's one of the reasons for the mass appeal. But more than the style, it's, and what gave life to the style, to the creative process of the style, my theory is that another universal language, so to say, is hope. Hope for the accused, forgiveness for the accused, the projecting value on people who, just because they murder, does not, stop them from still having names, still being people. The fact that we know what led up to these hideous murders, is what humanizes the murderer. That's something that a lot of traditionally romantic stories didn't want to do. So I think this is as groundbreaking and relevant today as it was back in the day in 1866, a bygone era that is not remembered. So some people call this the first crime thriller. I love that. It's ironic because I would say, having read a lot of recent popular crime thrillers that I'm a fan of, it's almost as though you can see what separates a classic from a crowd pleaser. The crowd pleasers have their heyday. They have their fandom. Their fad comes and goes. But if you want to write something that's of eternal value, it's got to have an open mind and an intention to find and discover universal truth. Now, there's a transparent quality, almost as seeing the narrative come alive in this book, that is more profound than any other crime thriller that's ever been written since, because it's so layered with honesty, honest reflection of reality in the style, the delivery, from the dialogue to the descriptions. And I could talk about that forever. I'm trying not to. To the sympathy for the accused, so to say, the humanity of it. That's something that Western society really needs. I think that this book should be reconsidered in terms of its value to modern American audiences, honestly, and but analyzed on an individual level. Like, we shouldn't delegate institutions and bureaucracies to dictate the worth of literature. The relationship you have with the book itself is always going to be individual, and you might actually pull more ideas from it than through that relationship than the invested merit that the work has in and of itself. It's like having an ongoing conversation with the collective, worth of universal moral laws and truths themselves. It's a spiritual experience. This is what separates this as a classic rather than a work of like pulp, despite having arguably some very exciting, suspenseful moments, which is unusual in a classic work, which is typically seen as being like, a little bit annoyingly cliche and black and white or romantic, or goody two shoes type, dry, like Jane Austen or something. You know what I mean? So like there's nothing wrong with ideals, but they don't age as well. So this book is just aged better with time. it's really a cut above the rest for me personally as far as classics go. It's my probably second, maybe first favorite classic work of literature I've read to this point in my life. And I connected with this book a little bit too much. So that goes to show the intensity of my former self, at the time I wrote this story. But it's an ongoing, people change with time. It's a process, Yeah, but in any case, the biggest takeaways in summary, freaking realism, projecting and remembering and resurrecting the idea that all human life matters, like destruction and chaos and is bad in and of itself. But also so is society's by contrast to like the proposed ideals of this book in general to the real world which it is based on. It is it's a moral wake-up call to what society lacks in cases like this, cases of crime where there is no right and wrong. It's a whole host of different things to weigh into the balance. So when you make a ruling, that's why it's a good book for judges and juries and lawyers and such, and policymakers and law enforcement officers as well. It's like it weighs into the balance so many factors and so many details because Judeo-Christian principles and just humanistic principles should be the bedrock or the underlying foundation of all attempts at ordering civilization, which is just this never-ending. If you were going to see, like, put on the truth glasses, metaphorically speaking, and see through all of the lies and commercial ulterior motives that compose so much of how our systems operate, I think you'd see a very chaotic free-for-all of very worthy souls that are often being thrown under the bus and taking a fall for everyone else. For example, how many people in our current prison system truly deserve to be there at this present time? That's a question that nobody really wants to ask. That's why it's impossible not to be, stimulated by the content of this work. It's so interesting, so to say. So in any case, I should stop right here because I could talk about this amazing book all day. It is a hope-inspiring experience. It is challenging. It is a spiritual experience, and it's very immersive. If you were just reading it as a thriller, or just a lightly emotional drama, it works as both of those genres as well. So it's a good escape. And another thing about the style, the dialogue. My theory, as I said, I want to say better in summary quickly at the end of my review video, is that I believe personally that Dostoevsky was enlightened to an extent. He was compelled to find universal moral truths in humanity involving morality. And that is what bred a sort of creative, like, flow, a series of inspiration. And I feel like I can see that process personally as I'm reading. And that's because of the life of the characters and the dialogue and the sense of maybe it's also sort of a Russian thing. But I mean, I don't think it's particularly so because it just so happens that this book contains so much universal appeal across all nations, barriers, languages. You barely notice discrepancies in the translation from Russian to English. And if you do, it hardly detracts from the pace and the beauteous descriptive dialogue, which, I shouldn't say is totally poetic so much as it is beauteous to me personally, because truth is beautiful and it's bluntly going for that. Even if the content is ugly, it has a moral intention of trying to analyze evil so that it empowers people to know how to respond to it and how certain innocent souls get it inside their system, so it stews and it tempts them and deceives them into doing crime, bad things that can be dangerous to others. And so it's just such a powerful experience that I love so much. I highly recommend Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. It's funny, I've only read this book once, and I haven't read any of Dostoevsky's other books, but I will be giving review videos on that. I probably will, break down different themes and qualities for analysis to relate to present modern social paradigms and such, and political issues in the future. that's not a guarantee, but it's, there's just too much to do in the world, and life is short. So I don't know if I will ever get to that, but I do want to. I can easily. It's hard for me to imagine that unless I get killed in some freak accident, that I won't be reading all of Dostoevsky's other works multiple times, because I feel such a strong connection to them. It really fills me with life, and I really hope other people can discover those universal truths with this as a spiritual catalyst, so to say, in the future. And that's why I want to bring attention to that, to reanalyze its worth with the hype, because greater, smarter analysis that's more persuasive is out there, is available. It's up to you to discover that, like in the greater world of the summation of academic studies and literature, humanity fields. Like I'm more of a, at this point in my influence on society career, so to say, more of a pop culture person. But just so happens once in a while, a work of classic literature really speaks to me. So this is one of my absolute favorites, like must read, essential reads. Thank you. Bye.